Hello and welcome to the second part of our 2020 Waterway Restoration Conference webinar programme, jointly run by the Inland Waterway Association and the Canal and River Trust. My name is Katie Woodruff and I'm the Restoration Coordinator for the Canal and River Trust. And for today's webinar, we're thrilled to be joined by Peter Walker, who is the Canal and River Trust Head of Technical Support, who will be talking about a very important process, taking your canal from restoration to operation. A topic that I am sure at whatever stage you may be at in your restoration will play an important part in your long-term planning. So on that note, I'll hand over to Peter and we'll take it from there.
Great, thank you very much, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you'll find the next half an hour or so of interest. I'm going to cover things to think about when we move from the restoration phase of our canal to the operation phase. But I think the first thing to remember is actually restoring canals is great fun. This is just a trawl that I've gone through recently to find some images of people enjoying themselves restoring the canal network. Some of these pictures are mine, some are borrowed from various sort of social media feeds, but I think they all show the same thing really, that the canal restoration is great fun. Loads of people love to get involved. There's a great sense of camaraderie as things are being restored. My favourite picture is the one towards the top, the black and white one, which I think was taken on the Chesterfield Canal and dates back to the 1970s, but there's a classic 1970s haircut there and the gentleman looks very proud of what he's doing. But throughout the decades, you know, people love restoring canals, and that's great to remember. But we need to think maybe about what happens when we move from that restoration phase to the operation phase. This picture just shows the Hollingwood hub on the Chesterfield Canal as it was when the restoration had just started to how it looks today. But so there are different things to think about as you move from restoration to operation. So I'll look briefly, we've had a quick introduction now, we'll look briefly at fundamentals. I think in discussion with a few colleagues around the business, I think we can whittle it down sort of three things to think about as you move to the operation phase, to make sure you've got control over your network in all its widest sense. Make sure you can make it pay, actually, generate income to look after your restored canal, and also appreciate and understand the risks that you have when moving from the restoration phase to the operation phase. There's also things to consider as well, like how can you add value to what you're doing, the role that volunteers can play on an operational canal, and starting to think about visitors who will come and want to enjoy and relax and experience the restored waterway from a different perspective to maybe your volunteer teams that work on it at the moment. And think about how your restored canal can actually engage with the local community and provide benefits to society. I had a couple of questions over the years about the Canal River Trust's view about possibly acquiring restored waterways, so we'll cover that as well. There'll be a couple of little short breakout sessions to get you familiar with using the chat box throughout the presentation, just to break things up a little bit for a couple of minutes here and there. And Katie will just mention that when we come to them. So first, looking at making sure that we've got control. So I think the first area of control, in a way, is making sure that you've got some right to use the land that the restored canal is going on or over. Now, ideally, it would be great if we all owned the stretches of canal that we're restoring, but that's not always possible. Other options are to have a lease or some form of legal agreement with the landowner. Often the landowner might be a local authority, and that's often much easier to get an agreement in place with them. But again, landowners could well be private landowners because once a canal has been abandoned, then the land ownership can change many times over the years and the decades. It's best not to rely on a verbal okay from a landowner for anything other than your preliminary work. It's really important to get control over that land, either by owning it or leasing it or some other legal agreement. If you do need to acquire land and can't do it by a negotiation, then I suppose you might say the nuclear option, but a much more comprehensive option is to go down a Transport and Works Act route, and that does need an Act of Parliament, and that will give your organisation, or the promoter if you like, the power to acquire land through compulsory purchase powers. So whether the landowner is happy to sell or not is largely irrelevant. The compulsory purchase powers would kick in there. That's very expensive time consuming to do, but it is an option. And it's how major infrastructure projects, a bit like HS2, are being delivered at the moment. The HS2 legal framework is not a Transport and Works Act, but it's a similar piece of legal legislation that gives the HS2 organisation the right to acquire land from landowners. Other things to think about is the status of the Navigation Authority. There's a bit of a thread through the presentation about really checking whether you are the Navigation Authority for your bit of restored waterway. But the Navigation Authorities were established through Acts of Parliament when the canals were authorised originally, and those powers might well sit with a company of proprietors, and some original company of proprietors do still exist out there. So if they still exist, it is possible that those Navigation Authority powers are still there, and if that company of proprietors has been transferred to the Restoration Group or local authority, for example, then there may well be a Navigation Authority sitting there ready to be used. You need to make sure you've got rights to take and impound water. Obviously, water is the lifeblood of any canal. Without water, we can't operate it. We'll talk about water a bit later on as well. You also need the ability to fully operate and maintain the waterway and the associated structures. So things like access to these various structures that you might need to get to. You need to think about how you're going to get access to them, to repair them and maintain them. And of course, not much you can do without money. So we need to find a way, if you like, to control our destiny regarding income, to fund ongoing maintenance, to look at various income streams that you can develop during the restoration phase that will help to pay during the operation phase. And we'll look at some of those as well. A little bit more about navigation authorities. I mentioned just earlier that a navigation authority is brought into being by statute off the back of an Act of Parliament. And if there is, it's worth checking again to see if there is a statutory navigation authority for the restored waterway. It does depend on the terms of the abandonment. If the canal has been abandoned, it may well be all navigation powers have been extinguished. Obviously, we're probably aware, and some of us probably on the call are aware that some canals were never formally abandoned. So those the navigation authority powers could still be sitting there. Navigation authorities also have additional rights, often have additional rights. For example, the right to enter third-party land, to discharge water into watercourses, etc. So it's really good to see if there is a navigation authority there. Also, navigation authorities have a excuse me, a statutory authority defence in common law, so a way to, if you like, rebut claims of noise, smoke, nuisance, that sort of thing, because you actually need to undertake the statutory undertaking, which is to look after the canal. So that's quite useful as well. Again, mentioned earlier that the original powers and duties of a company proprietors under enabling legislation may be passed on to a restoration group or another body. So worth checking that if you have colleagues within your organisation that are of the legal persuasion, I think. With regard to Canal River Trust, just a bit of information that our powers as Navigation Authority, they apply automatically to any inland waterways we own or manage. And that's due to the various British Waterways Acts over the years that have come into play. So with respect to Canal River Trust, we are quite lucky that we almost automatically are the Navigation Authority for waterways that we own or manage. Of course, you can also use landowner powers as well, which are different, but maybe not as wide-ranging as if you are a navigation authority. You need to think really about how you're going to make the restoration pay. Maybe a fundamental decision to make at some point as restoration nears completion is whether you want to look after it yourself as a restoration group or transfer it to somebody else. Other navigation authorities out there, the biggest one are ourselves. Canal River Trust, we look after about 60% of the inland waterways in England and Wales. Environment Agency look after about 30% through the non-tidal Thames and the East Anglian waterways, the Nene and the Ouse, for example, and their tributaries. We've got Inland Waterways Association who look after the Chelmer and Blackwater, and some local authorities also look after navigations. And there's others like the Norfolk Broads Authority. So there are other waterway owning, maintaining entities out there that you might wish to seek to see if you can transfer it to. Or you might decide to look after it yourself. But whatever the decision, it's really got to be sustainable financially. So need to look at ways to generate income to pay for that maintenance. Most obvious one is through licenses or mooring contracts, depending on whether you're a navigation authority or a landowner. Just to give you some context within Canal and River Trust, that whole boating side of our business generates about 20% of our income nationally. So it's very, very important to us, and obviously could be a good source of revenue for a restored waterway. Other things that I know a lot of restoration groups do, things like trip boats, Santa cruises, Christmas cruises, festivals and events to generate income, can really help to fill the coffers if necessary. Things that might not be so obvious are things like utility crossings, and actually using your towpath, restored towpaths, as conduits or access routes for utilities, fibre optic cables, for example, electricity cables. There are also risks, of course, associated with running cables underneath the towpath in terms of when we need to do maintenance work, and be very careful not to inadvertently cut a fibre optic cable, for example. But there are potential routes, and depending on whereabouts in the country your restoration is, it may be a natural sort of cable route that could be worth talking to utility providers about. There are also utility crossings, crossings under or over the restored waterway, that may well have very old historic licensing agreements in place that need to be brought up to date. And by up to date, I probably mean look at the financial side of that, because a lot of these agreements may go back many decades and may just need to be refreshed to be more appropriate in terms of charging regimes, and some actually may be unlicensed and have been put in over the years and they need to get relicensed. So there's again a potential there for income generation through that. And again, the trust context, about 15% of our income comes from that sort of utility side of the business, including what I'm going to talk about surface water discharges as well. So surface water discharges, again, it's a way we can generate income. This is where we take water from an adjacent development or property, and the surface water, the runoff from the roof, for example, and the surface areas is routed normally into the local sewerage network, but it can equally go into the canal network if it's next door. Obviously subject to checks on water quality, how much water is discharged in, the velocity of that water coming into the navigation, and the angle at which it enters the navigation, for example, all need to be taken into account. But it might well be that you could offer a better rate for that water than the developer or the house owner putting it into the sewerage network. There are certainly parts of the country where the sewerage networks are almost at capacity, and water companies would rather not have any further connections. So again, something to look at in terms of a long-term sustainable way to generate income there. Other areas, if you are fortunate to have surplus water, you can sell it, of course. If you don't have surplus water but have local buildings, properties, offices nearby, there are potential uses for using the energy that's stored in water, if you like, in terms of the heat energy, to either help to heat a building or to cool it as well. Again, these could be very long-term sustainable ways to keep a steady income. In addition to that, there might well be small hydroelectric opportunities, but generally the volumes of water and the head of water, like the height over which the water flows, are generally quite small in canal restorations, although I'm aware that there are some small hydro schemes out there. Cotswold Canals, I think I've seen that one in operation, does generate electricity. Things like angling rights can generate you some income as well, to provide the angling rights to the restored waterway to local angling clubs. Property is particularly lucrative if you have managed to acquire canal side property during the restoration, or if you've restored canal side properties and businesses during your restoration. There's a real opportunity there to generate a long-term sustainable income through rents, for example. And I know there are a few restoration groups out there that are fortunate enough to have acquired property which they're developing. Other ways to generate income, of course, are through marinas and leisure moorings and residential moorings. So residential moorings is where the mooring is somebody's home. Those do need planning permission, of course, so they're not straightforward to provide as what we would describe as a leisure mooring, where somebody leaves their boat for a period of time, but their main home is on dry land, for example. A little bit about boat licensing. Of course, you need to think about how you can license craft in your navigation to generate some income, and also make sure that they're actually safe and not a hazard to other boaters. So there's the administration burden, I suppose, in the systems that you'd need to think about to generate licenses, to take payments, to deal with queries, and also to get involved in enforcement and action against boaters that may not comply with their license conditions or may not even have a license. So things to think about there. Do you want to provide a license for your restored stretch of waterway, or do you want to basically incorporate it in maybe the Canal River Trust license and also the wider licenses that also cover Environment Agency waterways? How would you like to provide that service for your customers? Something to think about, whether you want to do it yourself, or the Canal River Trust can provide a licensed sort of administration, a sort of back office service, if that's something that you'd be interested in. As a landowner, of course, you can permit access to the waterway through a very simple licensing system, but it's important to make sure that you include terms that make sure that the boat is safe and it's insured. So a standard Canal River Trust license will also include a check to make sure a boat has got a boat safety certificate and also that it's insured, and that's something that you need to take into account when providing licenses on your restored stretch of waterway. Navigation Authority powers, again back to the Navigation Authority issue, will depend on the statutory framework, but there are powers that navigation authorities have to refuse a license as well, for example. And also, if you are a navigation authority, those powers can often shortcut common law remedies for removing unlicensed and abandoned vessels or vessels causing obstructions. So you basically can get things done a lot quicker if you're a navigation authority. Thinking now about understanding the risks, really. I think the first point to make is that stuff breaks and it needs to be fixed. As you're restoring a canal, you haven't got that day-to-day operation, that impact with boaters that you will get when it's operated, and as well as infrastructure failures, which do happen occasionally, even to the best canal owning entities like ourselves, maybe due to climate effects, storms, floods, this sort of thing, even vandalism and that sort of thing. There could be both day-to-day damage and wear and tear from the boating community that uses it, or even vandalism, unfortunately, with paddles being left open, causing flooding and things like that. Infrastructure is expensive to fix. Pictures on the slide showing a typical breach. This one's up in Middlewich, but generally on the Middlewich branch of the Shropshire Union that we've repaired a year or two ago, typically a breach is £3 million to fix. And the picture at the bottom of the screen, a major problem with a lock, like a lock will collapse or partial failure, can easily eat up £1 million of cost. And those are done with contractors, of course, rather than the volunteer approach, because with an operational waterway, you need to get it open as quickly as practicable. And the more cost-effective route of the volunteer route obviously brings with it sometimes, quite often, penalties of time, and you don't often have the ability to spend a lot of time repairing a problem because your waterway is operational. You need to get it back up and running for your customers. So it's important to think about an asset management system. So to inspect your assets regularly, to plan works to them, to plan maintenance, what we call planned preventative maintenance, to think about dredging, because you will get silt churned up, which from the boats and possible silt washing in from prop washer on the banks and things like that. So there's bank protection to be involved in. The sort of basic cut the grass and put the grease on a regular basis needs to be thought about, as well as there may be longer term plans that you've got for major repairs and renewals of your assets. There's also a need for a rapid response or a call out arrangement to deal with customer problems or emergencies that are called in. So that 24/7 provision needs to be thought about. It may well be that someone reports in a problem that effectively is putting life and property at risk. So we need to respond instantly and get out as quickly as possible. Water supply, again, the risks are who owns it, where does it come from? We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Other ways to manage the risks and maybe understand them are to manage the restoration via a wholly owned subsidiary company, which is slightly separate, if you like, from your restoration group or the organisation that's running it. Inland Waterways Association use Essex Waterways Limited to look after the Chelmer and Blackwater navigation. And then ultimately, in the event of a catastrophic event, the parent company is protected because the risks and liabilities sit with that wholly owned subsidiary. I think if you can, if you have any surplus income, certainly consider setting up an asset failure fund, because inevitably something will go wrong and it's quite expensive to fix. So if you have got some form of sinking fund or rainy day fund, whatever you want to call it, that might be something to consider if your finances allow it. And don't also forget to consider the risks that visitors or users will encounter in terms of using the infrastructure. So make sure that you've considered it from a user and a visitor perspective and identified risks, and make sure that you've mitigated those. Could be something as simple as making sure that steps and things are non-slip, or they've got handrails and things like that. So it doesn't always have to be expensive, but little things like that need to be considered from a visitor perspective as well as the big infrastructure perspective. So I think we've got time, as I mentioned earlier, for a little bit of interaction. Hopefully Katie can help us out here. So over the next minute or so, if you could just use the chat box to let us know about 1 or 2 risks that apply to your restoration project, and then Katie will probably just read out a couple just to give us a bit of context.
Sounds good. So yeah, we'll give it a minute. Type in any risks that you may feel are associated with your project during this move from restoration to operation. There may be quite similar risks, they may be quite different.
Yeah, and thanks to Phil Sharp for confirming that Chesterfield Canal photo was the infamous plug puller. I'm sure Phil's got a big story about that at some point.
Okay, so we've got one in already. 2 kilometres of raised embankment, an aqueduct, and lots of locks. Yeah,
I mean, gravity is our enemy in a large extent, isn't it, in the waterway network? At any time that we hold water above the natural ground level, it tries to get back down to ground level. So embankments, aqueducts, good comment there from George, lots of risks there. Mining subsidence, yes, didn't mention that actually. Yes, I know that certainly we have had trouble with mining subsidence, and you eventually keep building your canal towpaths, re-leveling them, and you run risks with creating very deep waterways if you're gradually topping up embankments over time. You've got to be very careful about that. So good point from the Ashby team there. Yeah.
Water resources, unknown land ownership.
Yeah.
Abstraction by farmers.
Yes, people nicking your water, in other words. Yeah. There's a question there from Graham Pressman about can walkers claim for a twisted ankle for falling in a lock? I think it's an interesting one. There is a perception, there is a sort of appreciation, I think, in the wider insurance industry that people need to be aware of the environment that they're in. So they're in a countryside environment and they're in a canal environment. But I think the key that we've got to make sure is that as canal operators, we're not allowing defects that we know about not to be fixed. So if we know about a big hole, a pothole on a towpath, as an absolute minimum, we should just make it safe by possibly fencing it off. But if we're not seen to do anything about it, that's when the sort of negligence claims could come our way. So good point though, yes, yeah.
Okay. There's a few more there, just this last one. Adjacent landowners who do not want the canal restored, leading to deliberate blocking or damage. And this person has experience in both. Yes,
it's a good point, Ken. There are adjacent landowners that, believe it or not, don't love canals as much as we do. And there are a lot of difficult negotiations that need to be had, yes, in terms of just acquiring that land. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for your input, guys. Great insights into potential risks there, many of which, as I said, will be similar, but then you've got the others which will be quite different depending on the project. So it's brilliant to share this knowledge with each other. Okay, Peter, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Katie. And I assume we'll be able to share the chat at some point in the future. So these points will be captured. So
yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. A little bit about water. I know we've got Ken Fowler, actually one of our principal water engineers on the call, so Ken might be able to chip into the chat if I've got any of this not 100% right. Thanks, Ken, in advance. But it's very important to check whether you actually got enough water to operate the canal. It may well be that previous feeds into the canal have been lost over the years, for example, from reservoirs that have either been sold off, or the feeders have been rediverted, things like that, over the decades since the canal maybe was abandoned. So it's important to get a hydrological assessment. So that's the term for looking at the demand that might be created by the restored waterway, the amount of lockages, so that's draining and emptying of the locks that might be involved, where that water would go, and leakage needs to be taken into account. And either that's sort of through the ground. Canal channels are not 100% waterproof; they do leak. You do lose water through evaporation, for example. You do get a general sort of flow of water sort of through a lock, through lock gates and byways and things like that. All needs to be taken into account. Now we can assist on that, but I suppose we can't give any cast iron guarantees about whether the trust could accommodate the water demands from a restoration, because we don't actually know when that restoration is likely to connect. So I think we can certainly give some indicative information if that's going to be helpful, but we need to sort of maybe start to look at a timeline of sort of 5 years out from when restoration might well connect to give a bit more focused advice. But we can certainly give you some indications of the sort of water related issues that might come with connecting up to our network. Don't assume you can use the trust water as a default, because some areas of our network we've got a surplus of water, not many other areas we've got a deficit. So what we don't want to find is that we make the deficits worse, of course, for the rest of the network. So we can provide some information, but that will have to be sort of firmed up nearer the time, I think. In terms of acquiring water, some suggestions: check the enabling rights legislation if you've got that, to see if there is a right to take water from nearby watercourses. Ways that water can be acquired are through abstractions, through groundwater, through boreholes, through reservoirs, which would be extremely expensive to develop new reservoir capacity yourself, of course, but there might be existing ones. Or ultimately it could be support from water companies. They're happy to sell water, or able to sell water, maybe not happy, but they're able to. The whole issue of abstraction licensing has become more apparent in recent years, off the back of the Water Act 2003, which now in 2020 is starting to really take effect. But that Water Act 2003 removed navigation authorities' exemption to have an abstractions license. So navigation authorities could take water, but didn't need to get that abstraction license. That's now changed, and now all abstractions, apart from some that are exempt, but from rivers and streams, for example, we need to get those formally licensed. And the trust is going through that process at the moment with over 150 abstraction licenses in the system with the Environment Agency. And the agency has got to take into account the statutory duties of navigation authorities when determining the licenses, which is helpful. But of course, if you're applying now for a license, obviously, then a lot of our catchment areas are very highly stressed, if you like, and may not have a much capacity left. So you need to get those licensed in effect. So that's a major issue at the moment. As a navigation authority, there are exemptions for impoundment licenses to store water, but reservoirs are managed and controlled by the Reservoirs Act 1975. I think it's due for renewal, and those requirements are very onerous anyway, and they are statutory. You have to comply with them. Thinking a bit about adding value to your restored canal, I think talking to my regional director colleagues recently around the trust, I think it's really important to remember, I suppose, or remind ourselves that a restored canal will be a tourist attraction, a major tourist attraction, certainly locally, probably regionally, and maybe even nationally. So make sure you take the opportunity to promote the new canal, the new restored canal, as a tourist attraction, yeah, through all your various social media channels and news channels and things like that. And think about it from a visitor experience perspective. You want visitors, I imagine, to have a fantastic time, tell their friends, families, tweet about it, tell their friends on WhatsApp, this sort of thing, because you want people to come back and really enjoy what they get out of the restored canal. So think about it from a visitor perspective as well. How are you going to give them a great experience that they can tell their friends about? Volunteer opportunities. You might think that the volunteer community really just likes restoring canals, but actually, although that is absolutely correct, huge numbers of volunteers absolutely love to work on operational waterways. VLKs, sorry, that's abbreviation for volunteer lock keepers. The lock keeping volunteer position is probably one of the most popular and sought after ones that we in Canal River Trust deal with, but there's all sorts of opportunities. So don't think that once you finish the restoration that your volunteer support might start to dry up. But far from that, there's so many other opportunities. And typically, well, last year we had over 700,000 volunteer hours on our canal network, and that's the operational network. So don't feel that the volunteer support will dry up, far from it. There's other options like maybe a friends or a membership program to generate income. Think about how you can connect people more with your canal, with your restored canal. And think about customer satisfaction. That's the absolute key. How are you going to give your customers, in whatever form they are, a really great experience so they want to come back, support you and tell their friends and get more activity on the waterway. Other things you can do, now you've got an operational waterway, there are opportunities for external funding. There are lots of funding providers out there, even government at the moment, but you can apply for grants to help you achieve what you'd like to get out of the canal, and also the funders and grant providing bodies achieve what they want to get out of the canal. There's lots of funds out there and abilities to apply to local authorities and other fund holders for things to promote healthy walking, cycling, to promote people's well-being, to help work in communities as well. So there's just some pictures here that I've got that were recently, on the right-hand side is actually a light show that we put on in Birmingham to celebrate achieving some Green Flag Awards, which I'll mention in a minute. Pontcasilty Aqueduct, again in the middle of the slide. If you've got any iconic structures, and you may well not have something as iconic as Pontcasilty, but I'm sure there's some fascinating structures out there in the restoration fraternity that you could actually interpret with lights and have events that to help you generate income, the sort of thing that's really good to look at. From a trust perspective, we generate about £18 million a year from external funders. So there is funding out there, and a lot of it is in the health and well-being sector at the moment. So think about how your restored waterway can help improve the quality of life for people in the area, and that could help unlock funding applications, maybe in combination with other charities, to work together to generate access to a much bigger fund, if you like. Things like Green Flag Awards are a good thing to look at. They were historically looked at for sort of parks and gardens. We've now been able to secure a Green Flag Awards for over 400 miles of canal network, and that's not just the possibly pretty picturesque rural environments, but also urban environments in Birmingham and Manchester, for example. And of course, securing something like a Green Flag Award can then help you to be maybe a springboard to other funding opportunities. So and great opportunities for events as well on your waterway. So think about maybe how you can use the value and the benefits of your waterway to actually help the local community, and then therefore unlock access to funds, external funds. Operation is relentless, I think, is probably a closing point on the sort of operation side, but it's hugely rewarding. So good luck. It's exciting stuff. It's 24/7. And hugely rewarding, but also very challenging at the moment. So maybe in the post-COVID world, we'd be happy if you'd like to come and see, spend a bit of time with some of our operational and management teams to see, how we manage a canal on a day-to-day basis. And our local regional contacts are our strategic program delivery managers, which details I'll just put up on the screen. Just a reminder, the trust has got 6 regions, and each of those has got someone that's got a responsibility for the local restoration relationships. So we've got 5 people at the moment around the network looking after 6 regions. Probably best not to contact them till we're through the COVID problems in terms of visits and social distancing, but they would be your routes in to maybe spend a bit of time or talk to some of our operational staff. We're more than happy to facilitate those visits and meetings if that's something that you'd like. And I think this slide will be circulated anyway, so don't feel like you need to scribble down all the contact details at the moment. Okay, a little bit sort of chat interaction time. I think if we can do something similar to what we did before, maybe if you can just give us in the chat box an example or 2 of how you've managed to generate income to support your restoration, or how you've engaged with your local communities.
Thanks, Peter. We'll take 1 minute here.
Thanks.
So feel free to pop your ideas in the chat box. Okay, so we've got someone saying that we've earned £20,000 by selling named bricks that will go into an aqueduct. I love that idea. It's a great example there, Oris. That's Ashby, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, a really good idea. Named bricks. You often see those on community facilities like village halls as well. It's a good route. Yeah. Shop, visitor centre, sublet cafe at Hollingwood, standard range of trip boats, festivals, events, community consultations. Yeah. Parish Council grant to improve towpath surface for walkers.
Yes. Yeah, good example there from Derek. Yeah. Just a slide or so on the Trust's policy on waterway acquisition. We have taken on, as a Canal and River Trust, we have taken on responsibility for some third-party restored waterways in the past, or waterways that have been restored that were where the waterway was owned by somebody else. But all these decisions really need to go through our trustees to make the final decision on whether we would be interested in acquiring a restored waterway and taking on the responsibility for owning it and maintaining it, or somewhere in between. We need to look at the full life cycle costs, and the trustees, of course, have got full discretion. We have got quite a few challenges on at the moment in the trust. At the moment, we've got our DEFRA contract renewal. Our contract with DEFRA runs out in 2027, and we're now starting to talk to DEFRA about how we negotiate a new contract, hopefully all being well. And we also, on the back of COVID is challenging for us, but Toddbrook, for example, has a renewed focus on our reservoir. So lots of things that our trustees are wrestling with at the moment. But I think fundamentally, if you did feel that you would like the trust to take on a restored waterway, we needed to come with a sort of fully costed business case. So fully funded in terms of maintenance, and the liabilities fully identified and costed in some way. So that the restored waterway didn't add an additional burden to the challenges we've already got with running our waterways. So we need to look at whether it had a funding package that came with it, for example, and the water need was neutral or positive for the trust, things like that. So we'd also consider whether the restoration was maybe in an area that the trust hasn't got a presence at the moment, and whether it was connected or not to our network. I can't see a scenario where the trust would acquire a restored waterway that wasn't connected to its existing network in any form. It's just a bit too far remote. But I think if you are thinking about the future, please don't assume by default that the trust will take on a restored waterway. I mean, we love canals, we love looking after them, but the challenges are really great for us at the moment. So we need to look at each one on a case-by-case basis. I think it's probably the simplest way to describe it. So please don't assume that you finish the restoration, you hand over the keys to some regional person in Canal River Trust. It's possible, but we'd have to have a really good look and make sure that that it worked financially and from a risk perspective. Okay, just to wrap up, really, I think we've looked at some of the fundamental things to think about when moving to operational. Make sure you've got control over the land, the water, the access, the licensing, for example. Make sure you can make it pay, because obviously day-to-day operation is not a cheap thing to do. Obviously, being largely volunteer supported, the cost might be a little bit lower, but then you might need to balance that with the need to bring in contractors periodically to make sure you can keep your waterway open for your customers. Understand the risks, whether they be the infrastructure risk of the fact it is historic infrastructure that has been restored. There is possibly some damage that could be caused by boat impact, boat use, vandalism, for example, could be a risk that you need to think about. Think about delivering an excellent customer service so people are going to come back and tell their friends about this fantastic restoration that you've been involved with. And understand that volunteers are crucial. Volunteers love to work on operational waterways, and really I don't see why your volunteer support would drop as you move from restoration to operation. It's just different things that volunteers do, and volunteers can do anything, as we all know. Make sure you hold events, engage your local communities, use that as an opportunity to deliver external funding. Think about how your restored waterway can actually help the local community in terms of health and well-being. Think about what the government, the latest steer from government is, and how you can actually tailor a funding bid to allow government to achieve its objectives while you're actually getting some benefit to the canal. And really, finally, I think we've mentioned that operation is relentless. It's hugely rewarding, but also very challenging. So please be ready for that challenge as you move from the restoration phase to your operation phase. And I think that is it, Katie. Happy to take any questions. We've got about 20 minutes left, I think, Katie, haven't we?
Yes. Yes, just under. So we've had a few questions come into the Q&A box. If anyone still has a burning question to ask, please pop it into there and we'll try and get round to it shortly. So I'll start with the first one. So this is in regards to Canal and River Trust as a navigation authority. Does the taking on ownership of new/restored bits of canal make Canal and River Trust the navigation authority, i.e. does it apply to you only canals? Does it apply to only canals you've always owned? And then the second part of that question is essentially, I'm intrigued in what defines a navigation authority system and how this can be extended, created in the first instance.
I'll have a go at that one, George. Thanks very much. With regard to the trust, the various bits of British Waterways Acts of the past mean that we become the navigation authority for any navigation that we own or manage. So if we acquired a navigation, for example, we would become the navigation authority for that. So that's quite powerful legislation from the trust perspective, yes. So so it's a combination of stuff we've already owned and actually anything that we acquire or manage. I'll have to check the exact terminology, but yes. And the second part, what defines a navigation authority system and how this can be extended? I think a navigation authority is set up by an Act of Parliament, so it would go back to the original Act of Parliament, I think. Can't really say any more on that, George, but hopefully that helps.
Brilliant, thanks, Peter. Second question here. Many acts of abandonment just remove the duty to maintain navigation, but not necessarily the right. Some officially abandoned canals are still navigable. So have Canal and River Trust inherited the rights from the original Canal Acts to operate canals abandoned by BTC Acts in the 1950s? For example, the Lichfield section of the BCN, subject, of course, to land ownership.
That's a great question, Phil, but I don't think I can answer that at the moment. I haven't got that local knowledge, unfortunately, but we could certainly check with our legal colleagues, I think.
Yeah, we'll find out and we'll follow up this answer. Again, another one. Does Canal and River Trust have a long-term plan to restore all the unnavigable canals that it still largely owns? For example, Haverton, Grantham, etc.
From a trust perspective, I think we would like to restore the canals. We own the Grantham, for example, and the Montgomery as well, a couple of examples. I think the restoration of those has got to fit in with all the other priorities that the trust has got. So where there are opportunities maybe to seek additional funding, we could look at those, but we don't have a plan that says they'll all be restored by a certain date, Phil, but we would, where we can, we'd like to support the restoration of the ones that we've got, yeah.
Are there standard guidelines on maintenance and particularly asset inspections, etc., that Canal and River Trust have written that could be shared to allow restoration societies to develop Canal and River Trust compliant asset management systems? Yes,
we've got a standard called our Asset Inspection Procedures, or AIP, as our engineers call it. I could certainly let you have a copy of that, George. It is changed periodically, but that will explain how we inspect our assets. Yeah, certainly happy to share that.
Okay, another question here. We need to have a draft of a landowner agreement to enable leasing of the canal. Where can I find one, please?
I don't think I've got access to anything off the top of my head, Derek, unfortunately. So sorry about that. No.
That's okay. Will the Canal Society have to have a chairman, annual meetings, etc., and continue as the original Act required?
I think this is relating to if the company of proprietors is still in existence. It will have, if that's still in existence, it will have is it articles of association or memorandums of agreement that will say how it operates, and it will probably have to resurrect those, I suppose, to be valid. But I'm not a particular expert on that area, Ken, unfortunately, but it's a good point, yeah.
Okay, another one here. We own a stretch of the river navigation. Water is being abstracted from that section. Should we be getting money from this?
Good question. If it's being abstracted from a stretch of river that you own, then possibly yes. You may need to check the abstraction rights that apply in that stretch of river navigation. Yeah, it's a tricky one on rivers because they are that water sort of comes is natural in a way, isn't it, rather than sort of man-made or impounded. So I could check with my water colleagues about whether that would be appropriate to have an abstraction and whether you could actually sell that water.
Thank you, Peter. I've just seen a comment in the chat, or a question in the chat box, so I've just been drawn to this. Our canal is designated a main river. There is an act of parliament. EA seem to think they have enforcement rights, but landowner has responsibilities. We have an act of parliament. EA tell us it is overridden by recent legislation. Is this true?
I think you'd have to get some independent legal advice on that. I don't think I could comment, but yeah. Get some advice on that, I think.
Okay, we'll just do one more from that chat box. What water is fed from roundabout but brings silt with it? Is that allowed?
If you've got water coming from a public highway, then there should be some structure in there that will stop the silt getting into the navigation. So I think that is something to pick up with the local highway authority. Yeah, that, I mean, there's a discharge there into your canal by the sound of it, and that's coming with contaminated or polluted water. So I would pick it up with the local highway authority. Yeah.
Okay, so that's all the questions that were submitted in the Q&A box and a couple from the comments there.
Thank you for those. Yeah, like I said, we'll get back on a couple of those that I couldn't answer in instantly.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Yeah. Ken, there's a comment from Ken about feeders having silt traps before they connect into the canal network, and actually that is interesting, that point about maintenance, Ken. It may well be that that highway that discharges silty water has some form of silt trap which just hasn't been maintained by the highway authority, for example, and that's the sort of thing that you can get resolved on surface water discharge licenses to make sure that they're actually maintained as well as letting the water come in. But yeah, thanks, Ken.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think we will leave it there. If you do have any more questions, feel free to get in touch with us. But it's about time to wrap up today's webinar. We'd love some feedback from you all, and once this room closes you will see a pop-up box that appears on your screen. It will take you straight through to the survey form, and we'd really appreciate any feedback on today's webinar. So thank you all for joining. There's been a lot of comments in the comment box, which has been great, sharing your thoughts, questions and experiences. Really good. Thanks to Peter for taking the time to deliver the webinar, and thank you to our colleagues who are hiding behind the scenes to make sure all this runs smoothly. Last but not least, guys, don't forget to join us next week, where we will be joined by Alex Melson, who's the volunteer coordinator for the Waterway Recovery Group. He'll help us explore the principles of biodiversity net gain and how this may impact your restoration. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.